Okay. Da, da, da. There we go. Okay. Hi, I'm Aly Moore and I eat bugs. And that's typically how I start things off, just to raise some eyebrows. I got into this space because I'd always been interested in food and I studied public health in college. And one summer we had a thing in Mexico and I was an adventurous eater and just an explorer of flavors and came across a stand of tacos de chapulines. And those were super delicious. After that, I went home and around Thanksgiving time, I wanted to prank my family. And so I started Googling how to buy bugs in the US safe for humans to eat. And I came across a very paltry like selection of Reddit forums and a few discussion boards. I think Entimo Farms existed at the time, but it was early days. So I went to, I think, Petco or something and got some crickets and roasted them and ground them up. Um, I learned a couple key lessons. Don't surprise people with bugs if you ever want them to eat them again. It got me out of cooking for the next, what, decade of family meals. So if you want to get out of cooking or family responsibilities, may I recommend bugs? The other bit was I started learning more about the industry from like research, and I was studying food policy in particular. So I started talking to some of these companies I was seeing and engaging in online discussions and made friends with Jared at Entimo Farms and Pat at Chapul, some other earlier companies that are no longer in business. Went to some of the early trade organization meetups and conferences, and the people I met were so different from the startup folks I was meeting in my day job. In the tech startup bubble, you meet people who are after fame or money or like the sexy lifestyle. Very different in the insect industry, where you have pioneers who are doing this work despite the lack of funding, despite the opposite of the type of applause that other founders get. They get mocked and sometimes even threatened, more so today, where it's been heavily politicized. But I just really fell in love with the people who were doing these startups and these companies and their why. And so it became like a little family. And I grew up with the industry and completely fell in love with the stories. And that's why I started blogging. It was my chance to form relationships with tons of awesome humans across the world. And for as long as I could, I tried to remain Switzerland so that I could work with companies across all different verticals. Um, so that's the backstory. Uh, Andrew mentioned a case with a closet and bugs, and another thing I'll share is that for a bug person, I have a unique set of phobias that make me think if I can do this, surely anybody can. I came into this with phobias around bugs because when I was a kid, I had a couple uncomfortable ant encounters. I hid Halloween candy in my closet for too long when I was a little girl. And I remember stepping in there to get a dress off of like a hanger, and my legs started tickling, and I looked down, and my floor was just swarming with black ants. And they crawled up me, and I had to get showered down. So, enough of those experiences will make you uh, disproportionately afraid of all types of bugs. And that's the mindset I entered this space with. And thanks to education and curiosity, I've been able to overcome those. And I think that we can use similar tactics to catch everybody else up. So, my typical presentation is about the basics of eating bugs. I'm just going to like breeze through that so that you get a little bit more background, but then we're going to focus on industry instead, unless anyone has any burning questions about the entomophagy part of the industry. Um, but this is becoming a little bit like a time capsule. I don't know how much longer I'll be giving this talk because it's also my desire to keep up with the times and to more accurately like reflect insect agriculture as a whole. I think that eating bugs was a way to get attention and be a little provocative, lever the sensationalism to open doors and get in front of people who otherwise wouldn't take notice. There's so much activity in the green spaces and the future of food spaces. It's so hard to get anyone's attention in the era of TikTok. But I find that eating bugs does the trick. So that's how I get my foot in the door, and that's what is the good conversation starter. You can also use it to get in front of bigger audiences. Eating bugs has finagled me a spot feeding them to Bill Nye and Margaret Cho, or to Papa Roach, and it made two of them cry, which was very fun. Or to like Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts clubs. There's so many uh, places where you can talk about eating bugs and have a captivated audience. But where do you go from there? And that's what I want to focus the talk on instead. Just to do some context setting now, eating bugs is not new. That's a huge thing I tried to convey. It's not an emergency food, it's an everybody food. It's not a new health trend. It's something that has existed since humanity. The hunter-gatherers would feast on bugs back in the day. The fossil record for insects is a little more tricky to uncover because their exoskeletons don't sit around and fossilize like the bones of other more mammalian or bird prey that early humans would eat. But if you look across documents, you can see that even in more Western society, insects have a rich history. John the Baptist ate locusts and honey. In the Punic War, there are diaries explaining how the Romans would crush up locust powder and mix that with the flour and make bread that would have their soldiers marching for longer with a more complete nutritional package. Charles Darwin was doing what I do way before me. He would journal about eating bugs and their different flavors. And so it's something that's been going on for a very long time. I do a lot of advocacy, education events, trade orgs, research, kid stuff, International Culinary Center. I think that chefs are the gatekeepers, and if we want to see insects more deeply incorporated into foods and feeds, or as a functional food ingredient, as a gluten-free alternative, as a centerpiece in a menu that now focuses on telling the sustainability story of each ingredient. I see a huge future there. I think we just need more practice and play on the culinary side. Another huge part of this is reimagining what edible is. That's not, unless you're using it in the scientific way, it's like not so objective. Some people eat orange peels. Sushi went through this process where when we were xenophobic before the 1960s and 70s, sushi was disgusting and ew, how come these poor people, foreign people are eating raw fish? How barbaric. It took California roll, some photographs of some celebrities and politicians eating them, and now sushi is not just accepted, but applauded. Similar story with lobster. We talked about sensationalism. There's a time and place for it. And in the early days, I would also have a lot of deep conversations with different people from the industry, discussing like if it's okay to post a picture of me with a tarantula hanging out of my mouth. Like, does that do more harm than good? Will that relegate insects to forever be preserved in lollipops and sold at gas stations? That's not what we wanted. So that's why the work I explained, there's the tip of the iceberg, which is the sensationalism piece, but um, the whole iceberg is much bigger, much deeper, and not at all sensationalism driven. Um, Farming and safety, that's a huge thing that I'll bring up in talks. You guys probably already know this, but insects are so small that they quite literally are what they eat. In terms of crickets, if you feed them like a mint-based diet, they will have a minty flavor to them. So cool. I think there's just so much culinary malleability there. And if I like to compare chefs to artists, and it's like you're painting with primary colors, and then somebody gives you this box of cerulean and magenta and like all these different shades, and you can make way more vivid pictures. And I think the same thing goes with ingredients as tools. If you give chefs this color box of 2000 plus and counting new edible insects that taste different based on how they're prepared, what they've been fed, it's just there's so much we can do with that. And we'll talk about regulations in a second when we get more into the industry side, but good to mention allergens. If people get stoked after I tell them to eat bugs, don't eat them if you're allergic to shellfish. Only eat farm raised unless you're a trained forager. And insects have a huge role in the future of food because they work in such small spaces. In about a Taco Bell sized facility that's growing insects in like a vertical farm, could be in a city, could be on Mars. You can grow as much protein as you would get from a past year's worth of cows. So when you think about space economics and resource use, insects are just so efficient. Taste is the moneymaker if you're trying to sell a consumer-facing product. I think that's where we really missed the mark in the past. I would I would rely, if I were serving certain products, I would only serve them at like a bug and wine pairing because you needed that liquid courage to get you to try bugs, but also to maybe overlook the kind of weird aftertaste that many of the protein bars had. Today, we have a few products that I'd say pass the sniff test. I don't need to I could just give the product to somebody and they could like it. I wouldn't have to explain why it's cool or why, forgive the weird, funky aftertaste. There's insects in it. I think it'll be wonderful to have a few more products that taste genuinely fantastic. One that comes top of mind is Sauterelle. She's using grasshoppers and locusts to make a bug broth, and it's really, really good. So I think we need more of that if we want to see a future in the insects for human consumption space. But this is my bread and butter. So if we want to circle back here, I can talk for days about the different insects and what they taste like and how they can be used. Sustainability, y'all are pretty familiar with this as well, I'm assuming. And this is evolving as we're seeing more impact reporting being done, as we're trying to collect more LCAs. I have thoughts about a couple of LCAs that have been released recently. One was from some commission in Europe that said insects are way worse than soy and all these things. And I challenged the input. I challenge those studies because they were so narrowly focused. Those impact reports that say insects fall far short of soy and corn, they're missing all of like the circularity part of it. They're not taking into account the impact of frass on soil health and the increase in the soil's carbon carrying capacity after putting frass into it. They're also not taking into account the what was I going to say? Soil and then the waste diversion from landfill. That's another huge one. And they're not taking into account what the impact is of replacing certain, like, you need to take into account the entire supply chain, the food transportation cost. System parameters are very important. So I have been drafting a couple like response blog pieces to a couple of these LCAs that have been released that I strongly disagree with, or I think are part of me thinks that they're part of industry pushback because, like Ron DeSantis last year when he called out that global elites are trying to trick Americans into giving up their red meat to eat bugs, blah, blah, blah. Follow the money. He said that. Why is he saying that? Oh, one of his biggest funders is big fertilizer. Not a surprise that he's going to be stirring up conspiracy theories about insects when a lot of his money comes from a industry player that stands to lose a lot of market share when you introduce a highly effective low to no cost solution. The Frass is technically a waste product of insect production. That's not going to look good for fertilizer companies. We've seen tons of there's no smoking gun, but it's not that hard to like follow the money and see that palm oil and corn and soy, these big industries, along with fertilizer and other entrenched players, have always had a problem with the disruptive nature of insects. They are going to be the ones that push back subversively and hard until they are ready to acquire an insect company in another country or partner with one when it's at an appropriate stage. They just don't want the disruption until they can control it. And that's just how business works. So, uh, nutritious, we can talk more about that later on too if there's some interest, but um, insects are like nature's little multivitamins. And a helpful heuristic is the lower you go on the food web, the more efficient it gets. Lower trophic layers equal higher energy conversion rates and more nutrient dense because the lower you are in the food chain, the more you're responsible for above you. So the smaller insects are powering not just the birds and the fish that eat them, but the larger mammals that eat those, and so on. So insects have to be very, very efficient at their job. White bugs. Okay, we talked about these. Let's dive into the industry side now. Oh, this is not where I want it to be. And it's because it's the wrong one. Okay. Bear with me one second. Alrighty, so Industry. The hype is dead, but the underlying idea is not. Um, so very recently, a lot has changed in the insect industry, and I'm sure, like all of you, we've been watching Y insect, the darling of the industry, going through collapse right now, and it's not great. It's reminiscent of when agroprotein went through a similar collapse and the fear that sparked among investors. I, if there was ever a time for big companies to collapse, I would say it's now just because of our own climate. Like sustainability is not a huge focus right now. So we'll have to see how things in the US shake out over the next few years. Um, I get that Y insect was not in the US, but I have to think that there is an impact on like when one big market decides it's not going to focus as much on soil carbon capacity, regenerative agriculture, all that, the rest of the world will follow. But I think that we'll get to why I think Y insect and beta hatch and agroprotein and these other ones failed, but there are some commonalities and there's a lot to be learned. The modern insect agriculture movement began with a dream that was very seductive and clean. Bugs are protein. Protein is the future. Therefore, bugs are the future. But as we come to a close this year, the story is very, very different. The early 2010s were the era of discovery. We had an explosion of edible insect startups, Tiny Farms, Aspire, Exo, Chapul, Cowboy Cricket Farms, Big Cricket Farms, Ovipost, Rocky Mountain Micro Ranch. Nearly all of them are gone, or have dramatically changed their main offerings. What happened was we focused on food, especially after that 2013 FAO report that went viral. But a warning that we had shared in the early industry came to fruition, which is that insects as human food did get stuck in the novelty category. They never became a habit. We focused on the insect industry had always been quite isolated. I was interested in how it dramatically differed from, let's say, the early seaweed industry, where the seaweed industry, which has been quietly growing, did not corner itself off into a separate industry and have its own conventions and try to get market share and carve out a space. Instead, it glommed onto shrimpers and crabbers and folks that had the equipment to already harvest it and became just another revenue stream that was neatly folded into these other industries. It never became something that was a threat or competitive in a huge way, and could rely on the goodwill and support of its brother and sister industries to raise it up. And I think that insects would really benefit from doing something similar going ahead, partnering way more deeply with existing industries and growing side by side instead of trying to disrupt their way to their own major global category. So on the industrial side, insect meal for fish, poultry, pets, and soil barely existed because regulation had not caught up. So we had a decade in which insects were the future of food while being legally prohibited in many major feed markets. Okay, so we have regulatory evolution. EU, these are very generalizing statements, but the EU is the most advanced ecosystem. The UK is going through post-Brexit consolidation. The US is fragmented but formalizing. Asia is the fastest and most pragmatic with the most history. And Canada is quietly attractive. The past 3 years are pretty big because they mark the first time in modern history that insects have become legally viable as scaled industrial ingredients. Now, that doesn't mean so much to a company that spent the last 10 years trying to make it and already taken on a lot of debt and invested a lot of CapEx during this really tumultuous time with a lot of uncertainty. But newer companies could benefit from this regulatory environment. And I think this regulatory shift, not consumer hype, is what will define the next era. So we can talk about different product categories and how they've done. Protein meal is competitive mainly in aquaculture and pet food, not human food. It's still more expensive than soy and fish meal, but it offers functional benefits. And I know there's a lot of hope that true cost accounting will be more considered going forward, but on the back end, I just never saw that. That never was helpful in any MOU negotiations or like supplier talks. And by that, I mean you could make a case that even though insect protein meal is still more expensive than soy and fish meal by the dollar, the cost savings of having a lower mortality rate and having higher fecal integrity and more nutrient dense final products, those things could make insect protein meal like more cost effective, but it's too complicated to really count, and there haven't been enough studies done. BSF dominates in the protein meal category due to life cycle speed and feedstock flexibility. Insect oil, quietly becoming a highly functional ingredient market in pet food, monogastric livestock, cosmetics, antimicrobial coatings. Frass is the sleeping giant, potential to become a major category, but we really need real agronomic field trials across countries, crops, soil types, and climate zones. Um, Chitin and chitosan, they are very, very interesting to me. I think that's where the high margin dream lies if insect derived can outpace crustacean derived. Again, we need more research on that front. And then insects as bioreactors and therapeutics. That's another category that I would tell investors to pay attention to, like future fields. Why the first failed? Built too fast, misunderstood demand, chose the wrong funding model and potentially species, hired the wrong skill mix, oversold sustainability, built isolated mega farms instead of modular co-located systems, and politics and misinformation hit hard. So we can dive into any of these if we want to circle back here. I'll try to speed through the rest so we have time to talk and I'm not just talking at you. Um, Last 3 years, why insect collapse? Industry learned. Feed regulation opened up despite that. Wanted to highlight this bit because this is what I see as the most beneficial way forward, the most like reasonable way forward, but it comes with a lot of risk as well. But I see success coming from partnerships with existing industry giants. Maybe not as giant as Tyson and ADM, but those two certainly come to mind to make the example. Tyson and Protix, Tyson made a huge investment in Protix, scaling out to the US, ADM similar in InnovaFeed. Those partnerships will create that that industry that industry system that I was talking about. So let's see. We're also seeing the soil crisis mature. I don't know if that will hit fast enough for companies to take Frass seriously, but we'll see. Research and impact studies. We desperately need to improve this as well. We need multi-year Frass trials in agriculture. We need large-scale feed performance studies, bioavailability studies, veterinary health outcome tracking, LCA harmonization, socioeconomic community impact studies, environmental justice analysis, substrate to product conversion optimization across climates. So we can double click on those if that's of interest to anyone here. Partnerships. They solve almost all structural weaknesses of insect companies. I think insects should be inside starch plants, municipal waste systems, pet food supply chains, fertilizer companies, aquaculture hatcheries, breweries, and ethanol plants. So I think that the best early stage decisions an insect company could make would be to secure one or more deep industry partnerships, as deep as like a joint venture or whatnot. Another issue I saw was VC is almost always wrong for this space. I think it's almost always wrong for many spaces, but it's just the model that we have. But the short time horizons are completely wrong for the insect industry, especially based on what we've learned from the collapse of the last few giants. Better models would be green bonds, project finance, infrastructure funds, corporate strategic investment, co-ops, community scale circular economy financing, even crowd financing, equity crowd financing, if that picks up enough. Federal and state soil health grants, which we saw a huge wave of at the end of last year, beginning of this one, with the domestic fertilizer production grant being given to over 5 insect companies. That funding got frozen for many as well, which really caused some issues. But with friendlier politics and friendlier policy, I see the federal and state soil health grants really picking up again in the future. Insects are an infrastructure asset, so I think they should be financed like one. If I were an investor, I would watch feedstock and co-location strategy, species choice, product mix and offtake, not just capacity, policy and regulatory tailwinds. Oh, this should have been above, but You want to know if they're just selling commodity protein or also higher margin functional ingredients like antimicrobial peptides, specialty oils, purified chitin or chitosan, and then economics and scale discipline, lower capex per ton of capacity. Another huge issue I think we saw in the early stages of the insect industry was that same mix of wonderful humans that I fell in love with is not necessarily the best mix to grow early stage, high visibility companies. We saw a lot of pioneers, young college grads, myself included in that, PhDs and scientists, farmers, not as many skilled industry professionals with a deep Rolodex of potential partnerships to talk to, not many folks with relationships to lobbyists, not many folks with trade organization experience, insurance experience, no advanced marketers. We just lacked a lot of business acumen and relational leverage and assets in the industry. And I think that immaturity came back to bite the companies once they got big enough to fail. So a message I would give to each kind of category that I speak to would be to investors, stop asking whether people will eat bugs and ask whether the business model is feedstock sound, co-located, and multi-revenue. To founders, start small and make your operations the bread and butter. To incumbents, still, insects are not your competitor, they're your tool. And we're at the point where your supply chain must become circular, meaning resilient. To policymakers, treat insects as infrastructure, not as fads, and fund research, fund field trials, and fund community integration. So this is a loop that I love. This is how I like to talk about the insect industry now. And it's this correction from linear agriculture, which is what we have today. We have soil that we continually extract from. It gets depleted. It grows plants with lower nutritional density. They get fed to animals with lower gut microbial diversity and lower health outcomes, more antibiotics needed. And with the soil, more pesticides needed, more synthetic fertilizers needed. Ultimately, food products for humans where we have a lot of waste that gets sent to landfills. And that is our linear agriculture system. Insects represent a shift back towards the balance that nature has spent millions of years perfecting, where instead of this line, we create kind of an infinity loop circle. You have waste that does not go to a landfill, but instead gets fed back into the system. You have some of that, you're feeding insects, and the insect poop goes back to the soil. The insect body goes back to the animals. You reduce your need for pesticides and synthetic fertilizers and improve the quality and health of your crops. Same thing on the animal side. And the outputs are enhanced food security and just a more sustainable production system. So that's where I will stop for now and would love to dive into anything of interest to anybody. And that was a whirlwind, so thank you for bearing with me. So, William, I saw that you mentioned LCAs. What were your questions on those?
Yeah, great presentation. Thank you very much. I appreciated all that info. I've seen a couple folks on primarily LinkedIn who have been kind of bashing the insect industry over, I think, the LCAs that you mentioned. And yeah, I think a deeper dive into those by the folks that are making the statements would, I don't know, I think make the conversation a little bit better, but wanted to get your take on those LCAs that were published about the insect and some of the other agri-nutrition folks in Europe, and how that might be different from us here in the U.S. with different regulatory boundaries or different use cases.
Yeah, so I think we need more nuanced LCAs, first of all. Like, and LCAs are just so dang complicated that like they when we had to do them at Japool, the level that we were able to afford and focus on with everything else we had going on was going to be just a hype piece. And so this is speaking from like limited first person sample size, but it felt to me like less like a data, like a high integrity data study that we were going to present to a research board, and more like the decks that you build to pitch to investors. And that's a really important distinction because when you're pitching a startup company for funding, like we're not psychics, we can't control the markets. It's a sales pitch. It's not something that's based on science. It's just something that we're trying to get you to invest money into the company. And so there's a lot of guesswork and there's a lot of claims that are made that are optimistic scenarios, and investors know how to watch for that. My fear is that a very similar thing is happening with the LCAs, and you see a ton of hype on the in like way too optimistic of a language when the LCAs are paid for and come from the industry. And then you see the opposite, like a huge negative push from LCAs that come from independent bodies or outside the industry. And when they come from outside the industry, they're missing so much because they're not in here looking at all of the things that we want to account for. I maybe, I mean, I'm not an analyst in this sense, so maybe I'm just missing the information, but I don't know how they expect to collect all of the information that would be relevant to an LCA. You're trying to take into account, like I mentioned, the impact on soil and improving soil's carbon carrying capacity. You're trying to like do a exchange calculation. Like, what do you get in the pet food supply chain if you shorten the food transport by X miles for each ingredient? And if you replace this much soy with insects and this much corn with insects. So there's just so many moving pieces that I haven't really seen a prepared independent body that wasn't paid for by a body with a vested interest in an outcome one way or the other being overly positive or overly negative. Hi, RNA. So I think that we still need, we just need better bodies performing these LCAs. I think that, let's see. Um, so InnovaFeed and others have published impact reports quantifying like energy savings from the co-location and waste heat, but they show that the economics are still tight. The one that I'm talking about, I'm forgetting who published it, but it was funded by some think tank in the EU. You know, the one that I'm talking about with the soy and whatnot. That one just completely discount. Like we already dove into that, but that one I'm going to release a scathing blog post on it because it didn't take into account any of the additional outputs of an insect farm. It was just so limited in what it chose to look at. In short, that's what the issue with all of the LCAs are. I see. They're taking a very small slice and
So,
looking at that.
Allie, I'm sorry. I
Mhm.
hope you can hear me. What is an LCA? I missed that.
Oh, I'm so sorry. A life cycle assessment. And so LCAs are done to, they're basically like impact reports that are the, well, I hope that finance and accounting start taking into account things like soil health and air quality and water quality, things that we have treated like unlimited resources in for accounting. And when you're talking about um, impact businesses, the investors are trying to invest not just on a financial accounting basis, but also on an impact accounting basis. And that's where LCAs have really tried to quantify these impacts so that you can trade them and value them in the valuation of a company. Or, you know, if we're looking at ingredients and they cost the same, which one has the better LCA, the life cycle assessment? Which one from birth of the product to death of the product has a lower carbon footprint, has more responsible ingredient sourcing, blah, blah, blah. So these are really, really complex reports that try to take everything into account: energy of production, energy of dissolution, energy of transport, energy of the input materials. And the challenges with the insect industry are that we're looking at things that aren't isolated. They're not an isolated production cycle. They're part of this huge system: soil microbes, animal gut microbiomes. And not only that, but LCAs have been done just to show how much energy does it take to raise a cricket or a black soldier fly larva. Another challenge with that is it varies wildly based on the climate that you're doing this LCA in. So you can do an LCA for a cricket farm in two different states, and it'll be dramatically different because the states have different, natural heating, natural temperatures. And there's so much variability in there. It also depends on what you feed the insects, where that feed came from, how wet is it, what space do you give the insects to live in, how long are their life cycles. So there's a ton of variables, and I don't think that we've found a way to properly communicate those. And I think that the impact of insects is chronically and devastatingly undersold. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. Maybe with the application of AI models, we can begin to do better accounting. But we really need support companies to come in and help. I only know of a few that are focusing on the insect industry. Bug Mars is one of them. They're not focused on the reporting side of it. They're focused on the let's track, like, let's be able to actually count how many bugs you have in your farm. Let's be able to count how many of those bugs are healthy. So that's a really good starting point. But there's just so many challenges with the insect industry that are like very, very unique because where else do you have 100,000 micro livestock? That's not a problem that a normal industrial scale cow farmer will have to deal with.
Gotcha. Thank you. And yeah, that's kind of where my mind went to is like, hey, how can AI kind of fit into this of collecting all the data? But yeah, there's definitely been a couple folks that are pretty interested in publishing all the negative attributes about insect farming and not necessarily some of the positives as well, and just getting the data wrong. So um, if you could change how the insect industry or folks like myself could um, publish how the farms are run or some of the more positive news, how would you go about communicating some of those aspects, or where would you publish them? Would love to get your thoughts.
Yeah, I'm big on collaboration outpaces competition, and I think our industry needs to work much more deeply hand in hand with others. I don't think we've made an attempt at data partnerships. I think there could be so much good from that. We already have some good partnerships with some universities, but maybe like um, an AI focused data analytics company that is not evil would be great to find. And building those relationships as a trade organization would be super cool. Um, I know that the contract for the CEIF, which has recently been renamed, sorry, I'm not aware of that updated name, but more corporate and university partnerships would be good. I really like the idea of aggregating and anonymizing the industry data from North American companies. I think that that would be the best way forward. But I've been a little disappointed by I just see the collaboration is needed inside the industry too. And I see so many companies peeling off from that the moment they get a little bit of institutional financing. And I think that's so dangerous because it's truly not insect company versus insect company. All of them are going to need to work together to get even a fraction of the market share that any other like alt protein or major agricultural business organization has. So we need to work together. We need to invest more in our trade organization. Like everyone should be joining that. We need to invest more in our collaborative research approaches, and we need to not be so afraid of letting something competitive slip because as much information as we can get out there, the better. That will truly help everyone out. If each company agrees to share all the data they have and actually prioritizes it, that could change the game for everyone. But that's something I'm going to be trying to work more on myself too. So thank you for those questions. Anyone else? Anything else we want to talk about more? I blazed through this, so I don't know what is of interest.
Well, if no one's going to ask, I'm always curious about the failures, some of the first industries and how they failed. So lessons learned. And if they could do it all over again, what would they be doing?
Yeah, so the failures one, I want to start by saying like I would make the same mistakes that everyone has made. It's just difficult and can't predict the future. I do think that there was a lot of, after the initial hype, there was too much focus on cricket and mealworm. And that was because, we didn't have a lot of infrastructure to start with, but we did have some because there were big cricket and mealworm farms that existed. They were billion-dollar revenue companies in the US alone for pet food, for snakes, for exotics. Because we had that infrastructure and because there was some working knowledge, those became the poster children. They're not the most efficient. They're certainly not the best at dealing with a wide variety of waste streams. We know now that BSF is perhaps the best bet we are aware of right now. So I would change that. I think the major failures of recent were two huge mealworm facilities, dry mealworms. And so I just never had that much hope on those species. And then again, same issue, I think, driven by the VC funding model. Like you're pressured to meet these crazy time horizons and you're pressured to do things in a way that is not like farming just operates differently in a way that even I'm not intimately familiar with. But when you're scaling an agricultural business, it's about slowly scaling up that capacity. And then we drank our own Kool-Aid. Like we saw the insect reports, we heard about the hype, and time and time again you hear, well, the market is there. Like look at the Rabobank report. It predicts you know, millions and millions of tons of offtake by 2030. Well, Rabobank just went back and corrected that initial report that Chapul and many other companies were referencing, and it decreased that demand by 2030 by over 50%. So there's corrections happening even in the really enthusiastic market reports. Yeah, there was just a lack of foundation building, and the what that translated into was you were selling into the hype. You were saying, "Oh, the market will be there. We're building for this market that will be there," and yet it never came. No big company wanted to be first. They wanted to see like sizable offtake, and so you got stuck in this weird middle zone where yes, we were just exiting a decade of research, R&D, and we were ready to scale and to hit that next big milestone. But we didn't have enough of the hub and spoke approach, meaning it would have worked if 10 insect companies wanted to fulfill that one big order from Cargill, from Nestle, from whomever would buy that bulk insect to feed their fish or their cat food or whatever. So that didn't happen, and one company certainly couldn't feed into like those massive order sizes. So we got stuck with needing to accumulate a patchwork of very small supplier offtake agreements. No jump to that industrial scale was ever successfully found. And then all these risk factors, like back in the early day, big cricket farms almost got wiped out by a pathogen. We don't have insect veterinary sciences. We don't have a lot of good monitoring equipment. We have too many risks, too little hedges to those risks in terms of like experience to know how to work around them, or institutional backing to help in case a little mistake happens and you just need some stability to get through the next year. Insects companies never had that cushion. So if something went wrong, they were pretty much done. And that would have a ripple effect because there were so few companies playing the game. If one player gets wiped out and they happen to supply you, or they happen to work with one of your investors or offtake partners, that would spook them. And so we just saw little mistakes here and there, or little accidents here and there, sinking entire verticals. I know several protein bar companies that went out of business because their supplier didn't make it, and now they were relying on shipping in from overseas, and that limited their ability to make all those sustainability claims. And the overseas and the import-export game, that got very complicated with the geopolitical instability of the wars and COVID and the shipping and the supply. So, long-winded way of saying a lot of risks and accidents were not properly hedged or accounted for. We didn't have alternatives. And then on the big production side, companies got bloated. And this will happen if you are running a company as the CEO and you're one of the few companies to get major funding. You're gonna get caught up in the TED Talks and the speaker opportunities because you have a cool company doing a cool thing and there is a need for advocacy. But I don't believe that insect companies are anywhere near a place where you can have a thought leader, as a CEO, unless you are really stacked with an incredible executive team. I just don't think we had the proper talent in insect companies for one individual to be able to go off and do those things. I think that companies would get sunk by going out of stealth mode too soon and trying to become very public figures too soon. I think that nose to the grindstone is the only way forward, especially with limited experienced brain power available in the space. And then finally, like too high capex, just can't do that. Can't rely on those venture capital funds. So you need long-term flexible capital that is used to the seasonality and like kind of like the ebbs and flows of farming, and then partnerships to really make it work. So I think that this doesn't bode well for like how you attract youth and like bright-eyed, bushy-tailed people to this space. It's more of the grueling path where you need people who are in it for the long haul, who are down to live in anonymity for a few years as they get their feet under them and prove out these small wins and remain humble, and then scale up. Any other topics we want to touch on?
I don't know about time, but I got one question, if that's okay. So a model that I've seen a couple times is there's an insect farm. They take any waste product to grow their insects off of, and then they also have a B2C brand that they basically sell their insect products as, either Amazon or TikTok or different venues. And that seems to be pretty popular, and that's a way to prove revenue and prove, offtake for the products. But that also seems like that is a whole nother business in of itself, which is selling to um, very small customers and having a branded product and all of that's shenanigans. How would you say to go about selling insect products to people who then market and sell the products for a company like myself? How do you see that ecosystem of, there's growers, there's marketers, there's brand people? How do you see that evolving?
Yeah, so just to be clear, so you're saying you sell to companies that in turn sell to consumers. And how would you, yeah,
Yes, yeah.
beautiful. Well, I think that that's a great position to be in because I know a lot of the suppliers have gone out of business, and that's like a real struggle for folks. So the a lot of companies are relying on, like I mentioned, overseas imports. And so it's a huge win because a lot of companies want that USA made stamp. They want domestic, especially today, not just for sustainability reasons, but for like America first, you know? So that's a huge win already. I think the challenge will be finding those folks. So who are your customers? Hopefully there are enough, and hopefully that market is growing. Um, I would love to see. I think the issue is that a lot of, like, let's say, cricket flour providers were focusing on insect companies like cricket protein bars, blah, blah, blah. Those are so limited. Instead, I would focus on selling to Tractor Supply Co. or, backyard chicken feed companies, or in terms of black soldier fly larvae, huge potential applications in cosmetics, like the company that I used to buy from that made like a skin tincture just from like that oil went out of business. So if you're selling some, I'll be a buyer. It did great things for my skin. So if you can find, I'd say just go outside the industry as much as possible. I think we got way too, um, what's the right word? I don't know. Incestuous is not the right word, but you know what I mean? Like we got way too incestuous as an industry and we were just working with other insect people. But I think the real winners will come from having incredibly strong long-term relationships with like-minded companies that are way outside the industry. Um, so as many good relationships as you can find. I would say, like, instead of even going to the insect industry conferences and spending money on that, go to some niche other industry conferences. Go to niche soil stimulant conferences. Go to niche functional pet food conferences. Go to veterinary conferences and form relationships with the movers and shakers there. I That's where I personally see like the highest return on time invested could be. Start forming relationships with the dietitians that work on animal health in aquaculture, poultry, and pig feed. And then the smallholder farms too, like they get it. So working with them would be really great. Oh, I see zoos and aquariums. Absolutely. So I think that's what we've really lacked as well. We didn't have enough professionals in the industry with existing networks in those areas, and so we're severely under-networked. Then it becomes the individual's responsibility to go out and make those relationships and change those people's minds. But an authentic relationship can go a very long way when you have a product that does actually work. And I think that's the huge difference is they're used to getting sold these superfluous things and these data things that may or may not work. We have something that's as old as, dirt, not as old as dirt, but it works. It's what animals evolved on. The science is catching up. It's not all there, but in a flip scenario that they'll be used to, normally with a pitch, the more you do due diligence, you'll find some things that are like, eh. In the insect's case, the more you do due diligence, the better it gets. So it's an easy sell once you identify those high value partnerships and just work on them long tail. I think it's totally worth it to spend a year building a good relationship with a decision maker there. And that'll be your competitive moat too.
This is actually a great time to segue just really quickly because I actually really want to know the answer to this if anybody's got it. And this also might help you too, William, as well. So I had to write it down because this is a big thing for me. So agriculture industry is actually transitioning from traditional fish meal and soy-based feeds to insect protein. We like that. Or is it more experimental at this point and not an industry standard situation? And how fast do you think they'll do this transition? Is this something that's just going to stay as more of a novel thing and like supplemental, or do you think it will become more of the standard? Is it going to take years, or is it going to take like a decade to get there? Because I know like a whole stock of fish takes like what, 3 years of salmon to like produce and grow. Um, I just interviewed somebody who's a fish agricultural influencer, which is kind of like a wild thing to say, but we get talking about insects because I just talked to insect people a couple weeks before that. So I was really curious about this space.
It's, I want to say optimistically at the end stage of that early zone. I know that the largest trout producer in the US, for example, has been running insect trials for over 3 years now. A lot of these big players are quietly doing trials or exploring companies that they can acquire. So that's where there's a huge question mark in my mind is Tyson's a great example where they were talking to not Protix, but many other smaller insect companies, and kind of stole from them for a couple of years before deciding who they wanted to invest their money with. I think these big companies are very hip to what's going on. They're watching, and they're waiting for the highest ROI time to come in. So I think there is some timing that depends on walled off corporate strategy that I would do you a disservice in even trying to predict.
Uh, I don't need
I
to go
think,
into corporate strategy. I don't even want to talk about that.
yeah,
I was just thinking of like, Norway is the biggest producer of what, salmon. New Zealand as well. Scotland is coming up on the rise. Deep sea fishing in general, fish farming rather, is agriculture has become huge. I would think that those smaller, more medium-sized companies would probably be a bigger market at this point. We're not going to get the big. It's not going to happen. They're too tied up in red tape and government and all this other garbage. I was just thinking of more of how do we move from this soy-based feed to more insects. To me, that just makes more sense for a fish to eat an insect. But again, I am not as educated as everybody else probably is on this call. I'm just following the train here of thought.
yeah. I mean, you're spot on. It makes so much more sense in a very dramatic way. Like there is research there. Dramatic, like the fecal integrity, that's huge because when fish have diarrhea, that's terrible. And I know we're a little bit over. Are you guys okay to stay another 5 minutes?
Yeah, it's fine.
Um, awesome. So yeah, higher fecal integrity, lower mortality rates, lower pathogenic risk, like all these really good things, higher nutrient density. Um, that's what I meant by like the true cost accounting could suggest that it is actually cheaper to feed insects to these things.
I've also heard that in other circles as well, so that's a very echoed thing.
Yeah, and so it's frustrating almost. I think a similar pathway that we're seeing with chickens, where in lieu of the big industry movement happening, there are things going on there beyond our ability to predict sometimes, where I would say we're a couple of years away because the um, processed animal proteins thing, like there was a huge wave of regulation in the way of feeding animal proteins to animals. That came from latent mad cow era regulation. Most of this has just been upturned in 2021. So that's really not that long ago. There's still a lot that needs to happen before we see massive industry uptake, most of it dealing with supply. Maybe the research is kind of like laying out the clear case here, but there's not a um, supremely de-risked way for big companies to get as much supply as they would need to actually integrate this in at a substantial inclusion rate. I think we'll start seeing it in really small inclusion rates, maybe 1%, like we're seeing in cat food, which they're launching overseas first. Nestle did that in, France and a couple other areas before opening up US markets. But then I see the most likely outcome is that fish will follow chickens. So chickens are lagging in the industrial side, but the massive backyard poultry space is turning to insects more and
Mhm.
more. So maybe we'll see that like your fish influencer friends, maybe they'll feed their fish. black
We
solidify
need to
level
get the
derived
pet food
ingredients.
people on board too, the people who are talking about cats and the vets and stuff like you mentioned earlier. I think that I know it's such a silly world we live in that we have to talk to influencers now to get people to even realize what's going on. I've realized that more and more as I move in my space, but yeah, we're a strange place right now. I don't know what that's about. We love
Yes.
cats. Yeah. Yeah, my cats do too.
So the more people that can get that hands-on experience, the easier it'll be. But yeah, I wish I could give you a more concrete answer. Sorry for talking
No,
around things.
you're great. You actually gave me quite a bit. So thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, I think we're at time. Thank you all so much. I'm around if you want to hop on a call ever, just shoot me an email. You know where to find me. I'm at Buggable. And I'm
We'll have to get you
delighted.
on the podcast too, Allie. So I'll send you a note over in the new year.
Oh, awesome. That would be so great. Thank you.
All right. Thanks.
Thanks,
Bye.
Aly. Take care.